This Delta flight 4819, operated by Endeavor Air, it's a wholly owned regional airline by Delta Airlines, was coming into land on runway 23 at Toronto Pearson International Airport. Pretty windy day there, winds gusting up to 35 knots, about 40 miles per hour. And you can see the evacuation that was successful with a capital S right there on the runway at Toronto Pearson. Folks coming out through the R1 door just behind the pilot's bulkhead there at the backside of the cockpit in the front of the first class cabin. And then the mid-wing exit where they were able to get out and essentially walk away from this crash. I want to show you this incredible new video taken from the evacuation inside the plane that was inverted. The floor, now the ceiling, the bins, the overhead bins, now on the floor. And I want you to watch this now. This is actually the first time I'm seeing it too. Watch.
Give everything, drop it. Come on. Don't take it down. Take that phone away.
The instructions there from the flight attendant: drop it, drop everything, drop it. That is critical, especially in a evacuation like this. You want to leave everything behind and not hamper your way out of the airplane, especially because we saw scenes of this plane on fire. The black smoke was pouring out almost right away as the airport rescue and firefighting crews came up with incredible rapidity. Hats off to them for putting out what appeared to be a fire there, at least on where the right wing used to be. That is where the fuel is stored for an airplane like this CRJ 900. The configuration of this plane, 76 seats, and all of them were full. 4 members of the crew, so 80 people in total. We've seen reports vacillating between 15 and 18, injured 2 to 3 with critical injuries. But pretty incredible that this full flight, essentially everybody leaving with their life, a very different story compared to 19 days ago when we were covering the disaster, the midair collision over the Potomac River, where all 67 people lost their lives. A really incredible and miraculous outcome here, Wolf.
Certainly true. Pete, stay with us. I want to bring in some more of our aviation experts right now for some serious analysis. Peter Goals, how could a plane like this end up flipping the way it did?
Well, we won't know for sure until the Canadian Transportation Safety Board does their investigation. But as Pete indicated, winds, there were gusts upwards of 40 miles an hour. It could easily have clipped a wingtip and catapulted down the runway. It's happened before, and it is extraordinary that everybody got out of that plane alive.
Mary Schiavo, have you ever seen a plane upside down on the runway like this? What do you think may have happened?
Well, not exactly like this, but similar. And as Peter said, in those cases, in those other accidents, one was Asiana in San Francisco, one was United Airlines in Sioux City, and then a couple smaller planes. What happened is they came in on Asiana, they clipped the seawall, and then they didn't come in straight and level, and one wingtip hit the runway, and then the plane cartwheeled. Same thing in Sioux City. They had a gust of wind right as they came in. It was a long explanation leading up to that. But the wingtip hit, and then they flipped. And then in some other accidents, that was the same thing. And in others, it's where they have exited the runway and encountered something such as an embankment or other equipment that then caused them to become inverted. But in a scene like this, it is where a wingtip is hit. In many cases, it breaks the wing off. The wingtip is hit and the plane rolls. Fortunately here, no fire. In those other ones, there was fire.
Yeah. Pete Muntean, I want to play a little bit more of that new video of the evacuation. Once again, the slide clearly did not deploy here. Talk about the process of evacuating an upside down plane.
You know, I don't know if a CRJ like this even has slides, Wolf. It is really critical to get out because seconds mean lives, and everybody here escaped with their life. We saw in that first image there, in the first few frames of video, the overhead bins, now the floor, and folks clearing them to try and get out of that overwing emergency exit to get out onto the runway and into the biting cold, about 18 degrees Fahrenheit there in Toronto, not countering in the wind chill This is something that is pretty harrowing, and this is a good reminder that flight attendants are not just there for your convenience. They are also there for your safety. They are aviation's first responders. We know it was a crew of 4, so 2 pilots, 2 flight attendants trying to get everybody out and away from this airplane. In some cases, can be a ticking time bomb. Fire is very serious, and we know there was at least some smoke, which means fire in an airplane like this, and the airport firefighting and rescue crews did a marvelous job of putting it out very quickly. But a fire is about as serious as it can get in aviation. It's on a scale of 1 to 10, that's really an 11. So to get people out quickly and safely without many serious injuries is really key. Important to remember, a lot of injuries can happen after the plane comes to a rest. So taking off your seatbelt when you're now hanging from the seatbelt in your seat upside down can cause injuries too. When you release it too soon, that's when people get head and neck and spine injuries. It can be very dangerous. So it's really, really critical to pay attention to what the flight crew is telling you. And you have to imagine the terror that the passengers were feeling here was probably a pretty bumpy approach, but then they're in a dark passenger cabin with what appears to be maybe at least one side blocked. The left side of the airplane looked at least partially blocked based on the way the angle of the plane is rolled there, and trying to get out of only one set of emergency exits. This is clearly not a very ideal situation, and everyone did a very good job getting out.
Yep, that's very important. Peter Goals, we know at least 15 people were injured, 2 critically injured. 80 people in total were on board, 76 passengers, 4 crew members. What does the relatively low number of injuries tell you?
Well, it clearly underscores the effectiveness of 16G seats, Wolf. These are seats that have been mandated since the mid-2000s. Final rule in 2009 that said that aircraft have to have seats that can withstand a 16G impact, which this clearly was. And if by having those seats, passengers remain secure and in place if their seatbelts are on tight. Previous to that, we saw numerous accidents where passengers survived the impact on the ground, but were thrown helter-skelter within the cabin, and many died. So this is a real tribute to a government regulation that saved lives.
Yeah, the key is to have your seatbelt on and to have it on tight to make sure that you're protected. Mary, strong winds were reported around the time of the crash earlier today in Toronto. How much could that have played a factor in all of this today?
It could be a huge factor. And as Pete was just reading off the weather conditions and what the plane was facing, this aircraft, I was on one of these same ones going into LaGuardia, and this is how I happened to look up the limitations. The crosswind limitation on landing is 35 knots. If the runway is dry and clear and clean braking action, if you don't have good braking on ice on the runway, your crosswind limitation is 15 knots. If they had enough to get down and they were coming into land, they could have been in the right, but at the last minute it got a bad gust that upended them. And I've had that happen to me when I'm flying, and it's terrifying. I literally had the plane sit up on one wingtip. Now, I was lucky. It didn't catch the wingtip, but if that happened right as they hit the runway, even if they were within their aircraft limits, there wouldn't be much they could do about it except try to fly out of it.
Yeah, the winds are very, very critically important. I was flying into Washington Dulles Airport last night, and it was really windy, and the plane was bumping up and down as we were coming in. Fortunately, it was a safe landing and all of that. Pete, let me play a little bit more of that air traffic control transmission from before the crash in Toronto. Listen to this.
Toronto Tower, Endeavor 4819, contact Tower 23. Endeavor 4819, Toronto Tower, wind 270, 23, gust 33, clear to line on rate 23. You might get a slight bump in the glide path. There'll be an aircraft in front of it. Clear to land 23, Endeavor 4819.
So, Pete, what could the air traffic controller have meant when he said, and I'm quoting now, slight bump in the glide path?
Well, let's go.
What does that mean?
Let's go through it sort of line by line. That's the airplane, Endeavor 4819 or Delta 4819. You buy a Delta ticket, but the flight is operated by Endeavor Air. Checking in with the tower controller saying that we're on the approach to runway 23, meaning they're lined up. They were on the ILS, that's Instrument Landing System, essentially a radio beam that gets you lined up with the runway and on a glide path and a stable approach. And the data shows that the approach looked okay, may have been a little bit bumpy, but it looked like they were stabilized, they were on altitude, they were on speed, looked okay. The tower controller then gives them a weather report, essentially telling them the winds. Winds 270 at 23, gusting 33. So that means winds out of the west at 23 knots, gusting 33 knots, so about 40 or so miles per hour. That's a pretty stiff wind, and it's at an angle to the runway of about 40 degrees. It has about a 40-degree bite into the relationship, the heading of the runway. And typically in a crosswind, pilots will essentially, if this is the runway and the wind is coming from this direction, they'll point into the wind. It's called a crab, and essentially track straight down the runway, even though the airplane is pointed a different direction. Or they may put one wing into the wind and slip down to try and make it so that they could stay lined up with the runway.